Hey guys, it's Ink here again. I want to bring you another video. So once again, I'm really trying to get on this YouTube thing. I think that this format works well with people actually paying attention and listening. It's a little bit easier than uh, typing all those big long things on Reddit. Hopefully this mask will decrease on my deep breaths. um, so today I wanted to talk about basically like what are the signs of growth, what to look for, how do you know if you're growing or not? And this is all based on my my personal experience and some of the things that I also have researched about and found in the literature. And so one of the first things that I think you should look for is actually flaccid changes. And this is primarily flaccid stretched length. And so there's a lot of papers, and the data is actually controversial about whether like how much the stretched flaccid length actually correlates with your erect length. In the papers that are done by urologists, and it's the actual and it's some doctors measuring, they find that actually erect length can be up to 20% more than your stretched flaccid length. There's another paper I read that actually had a formula for like calculating basically how much force to exert on the penis to actually measure it appropriately in the sense of like how it correlates to your erect length. But regardless, especially if you're going for length here, you should be able to just pull, with a firm grip. Jesus, don't hurt yourself. Just take your time, pull and, pull firm. You don't want it to hurt, but you also want it to have a good amount of tension so you can get a reasonable idea. And you want to try to pull with that same tension every time. And you should see these numbers start to climb. And going along with this, your actual numbers in the device should increase as well. So for example, if you are extending and you'll notice that you go from using 5 rods to 6 rods, or I don't extend, so I don't know how ridiculous that statement is, but in some measurement devices on like the Bathmate, for example, it has a numerical scale that is not accurate at all, but you can see that you're progressing from 5 inches to 5.2 to 5.5, even if you are not, that's not necessarily correlating directly with your erect length. And so those are good gauges that yes, you are growing, even if you don't see changes in your erect length. I've also noticed that one of the first things I noticed was that it began to feel differently, like in my hand. I know that might be silly, but like, for example, when I would go to masturbate, it would, like, I actually have, my grip has completely changed from how I used to do it now, and that's due to size increases, but that was prominent very early on. I won't say very early on, but I'd say probably within about 2 months in, which may or may not seem like a lot to some people. It's early in my opinion. And I could see, and I could just feel it in my hand. It felt different. Along with that, you'll notice that your flaccid tends to be a lot bigger. At least, once again, this is my personal experience, and I think this is largely contingent upon pumping. But you kind of retain a little bit of a pump. Depending on how hard and how long you go, you can have a little bit of edema still. But in general, my corpora cavernosum and spongiosum stayed more engorged throughout the day. And so I got just a bigger flaccid, with the caveat that I have always been a tremendous grower. I mean, Jesus, especially like when I'm working out, that thing, I used to joke that it looks like an acorn. Sometimes it would even turtle in depending on how hard I was working out or playing basketball. So especially if you are a grower, you will notice that your flaccid length will increase quite a bit. Going along with this, you'll notice that it'll also feel different. And so in your hand, it'll actually look different as well. And so now this goes for directly with erect length. I would notice that it seemed like it was looking fuller, it was looking thicker, it was looking bigger. And this is even when it didn't necessarily correlate with the actual erection measurements. So that's something to keep in mind. My significant other actually started making comments. These started actually about like 6 weeks in, maybe 8 weeks in to my routine, and she would say things like, I know this sounds crazy, but is your dick getting bigger? Or like, actually, I'll never forget, as long as I live, I was outside peeing. I live in an isolated area, and she happened to like look over and saw me, and she said, "Oh my gosh, that's huge." And that's the first time she had like ever commented on my size ever. And so it's just, that was one of the more meaningful things. And I've seen a lot of guys do it. And I think one of the most validating things is when you can actually have somebody mention that and it's unprompted. It's not like, hey, sweetie, do I look bigger today? It's just like out of nowhere, like, dude, that thing is bigger. And that correlates with actually sex as well. It would be like, oh man, like it felt like you couldn't go in as far today. Like what was going on? And so, especially if your significant other does not know about PE. And so I think one of the last things to increase is actually the numbers. I think part of this is because it's really hard to replicate like an intense erection outside of actually injecting with the solution like Trimix. So there's such a fluctuation in erection quality. I know for me, it's like I'll try to get as hard as I can, and then as soon as I start to measure, that's not a very arousing procedure, and so I pretty much immediately start to lose at least a tiny bit from like my highest, like most hardest erection. And so that's why I think part of the last gains are in the erect category, but I also started to see erect gains relatively early on. Definitely within the first 8 to 12 weeks, I had measurable increases. And so you should definitely look for measurable increases in your erect, but just make sure that you're replicating the same situation that you're measuring in each time, and just try to be as consistent as you can with your measurements. Try to use the exact same tape measure in the exact same position. I like to use the exact same background, just because the more consistent you are, even if you have fluctuations, you should still see an upward trend, okay? And so lastly, I just wanted to include some tips for what to do to while you're trying to kind of measure and see this growth. Number one is just be patient. I've posted so many times before, but I think I grew pretty quickly, and I grew at a rate of about 0.08 inches per month. And I'm still continuing pretty much on that trajectory. I have had to take some breaks here and there for different life reasons, and for actually different injuries as well. But that's been the rate. And, over this course of a year, that adds up to over an inch in length. And, obviously that's what most people know, that I've gained well over an inch now. I would not measure more than once a week. You get going and it feels bigger, it feels like it looks bigger, and then you go to measure and it's the exact same. And once again, there's differences in erection quality, or it could be kind of a placebo effect. And so I wouldn't recommend measuring more than once a week. And in a perfect world, I'd say you measure closer to probably every 3 or 4 weeks. Because that'll give you a more accurate representation, because the growth we're talking about in length and girth is, these are very small, even on a monthly rate for most people. And when you do measure, I'm all for, posting on our subreddit, r/getting bigger. But just be careful when you post, because like if you have a before picture where you're clearly not that hard and you're using a different ruler, and then you post an after picture and you're hard as can be, and you have a different measuring tool and it's after you pumped, you're going to get called out. And I think that those honestly are a disservice to I'm getting a phone call, patient's ready. Those are a disservice to to the people who are actually doing PE and doing it right, because people will see that and criticize it and say, oh, these aren't real. Like, look, you can see where the rings are from where he pumped, or, you can clearly see he's pushing in the ruler more. And so you want to try to be as consistent as you can that way, and try to not post when like the situation is different. I like same time every morning after me, in the same way as how I measure, basically. And finally, just trust the process and enjoy the process. This is the long burn, so you got to take your time, be consistent, don't measure too often, and you'll get there, man. I still can't believe the gains that I've made. So just don't give up. This is the long game, pun intended. All right, guys, hope you enjoy this one too. Talk to you soon.